Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bold Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. As always, I am Alex. So I reached out to Twitter and YouTube for questions on this combine pre-draft week, if you will. I think we're 11 days from free agency, something like that. So things are going to get popping pretty soon. And obviously, it is combine week. So we've already seen the performances of a lot of the defensive tackles, defensive ends, cornerbacks, safeties, tight ends. So been a fun group so far. But I wanted to reach out to you guys because I don't think I've done a Q&A since December. I think it was like a day after Staley and Let's Go were fired. And then my semester ended. So I wanted to catch up. It's been 3 months since I haven't, been talking with a guest and just been talking strictly to you guys. So without any further ado, let's get into some of your guys' questions. These ones come from Twitter first, at James Pinkard. There's a lot of talk about cutting trading Mike Williams. However, when healthy, he is a bona fide wide receiver too. With the emphasis on strength and conditioning hires, could there be an argument to keep or even extend Mike Williams with the expanded cap? So this is a question, I think I've gotten from a couple people regarding, Mike Williams, and certainly with the new cap measures, and Ortiz sort of alluded to this in his press conference, that their measures don't have to necessarily be as drastic anymore because they do have a little bit of leeway with the cap. So in theory, right, the scenario where you keep 3 of the 4 of Keenan, Mike, and Bosa, Mac is certainly looking a little bit more likely than it did, a week ago prior to the new cap numbers coming out. So from that standpoint, I do think it is slightly likelier. But I think when you look at the particulars of Mike Williams' situation, he is a 30-year-old receiver coming off of a torn ACL, unfortunately, on the cap hit he's on at a time for the Chargers where it's sort of hard to trade him because of, what this wide receiver class is shaping up to be. And I also just think the Chargers were always kind of in the position where they were going to move on from one of Keenan or Mike. And, Keenan had 1,200 yards last year just by missing 4 games. And Mike, unfortunately, tore his ACL. But I just think you're obviously not cutting Keenan. You're probably extending Keenan in all likelihood. And, given that he was one of the very first players Jim Harbaugh mentioned, and I think he, is a career-long Charger, I think he's going to stay here for a very long time. And you're not cutting both Joey Bosa or Khalil Mack. You're probably moving on from maybe one of them. So I just think, unfortunately, it makes Mike Williams the odd man out to some extent. And just from an organizational standpoint, I don't think it's the smartest thing to extend both Keenan and Mike anyway, even if you could, because now you're talking about 2 receivers who are going to have, cap hits going forward of about 20 to 25 million per year, maybe higher, right? So I just think once you're getting to that point, it's a little unwise. I love Mike Williams. I kind of wish he would stay with the team, but I just think it kind of is what it is from a money and team building standpoint, unfortunately. But would love to see if there's maybe some creative way they can keep him around, but I just kind of don't see it in this wide receiver class. And Ortiz has, alluded to the depth of the wide receiver draft this week. So from a team building standpoint, I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. And even if you look at, the end of the Telesco era with that final pick being Quentin Johnston, I think it made it clear, regardless of our feelings on Johnston at this point, that to some extent for the organization, this was always kind of the plan to draft a cheap receiver, so to speak, and move on from Mike. So I think it's raised the chance of their cap measures having to be less drastic between the big 4 contracts, but I still kind of think Mike Williams is the odd man out there. This comes from Jake Hansen. How highly, if at all, do you think we could draft a center? JPJ seems unrealistic after his Senior Bowl performance, but second or third round seems reasonable. if the talent is there for center 2 or center 3. We could certainly see the difference between Lindsley and Clapp last year. That is true. No, I mean the run game, the pass blocking did too, but the run blocking after Lindsley went, it's the run splits are atrocious. But yeah, how high could I see them drafting a center? In theory, there's an argument that they could trade back into the first round, and do what the Ravens did a couple of years ago with Tyler Linderbaum and do that with Jackson Powers Johnson. I don't really think that happens given how much Ortiz has wanted to probably. I mean, not that he's said this obviously publicly, but I do think Ortiz sees a bunch of holes on this roster, and I think he's more likely to trade back than he is to trade up, which is crazy to say that about a Chargers GM entering the draft. So I think the highest they take a center is probably round 2 at pick 37. You could be talking about Frazier out of West Virginia. You could be talking about a couple other guys there. But I that's the highest I could see them doing it. And then lowest, I think you're talking about, somebody like Cedric Van Pran in rounds 3, 4, Drake Nugent on day 3 later in the draft. I also think, and we have a couple other questions on center, so I don't want to get too much into it now, but obviously what they do at center depends on, in the draft, depends on what they do in free agency, right? If they go just kind of re-sign Clapp and company versus if they dish out money for one of the more, premier options in this free agency class, then I think that kind of probably impacts the round that you're, seriously thinking about taking a center. But we'll get to the center in a bit. Stephen Gallard at Undrafted Analyst. What players outside of the obvious do you believe could be in the future plans for the Harbaugh era, if any? Harbaugh's obviously mentioned Herbert, Derwin, Keenan pretty consistently in his commentary, and has mentioned Bosa or Eckler kind of in a passing sense. Obviously, they still have to figure out what to do with those guys. Player that is outside the obvious that could be in future plans. It's tough to say because he is a free agent, but I do kind of look at Alohi Gilman as a guy that, again, is coming off of the year he did last year. Has a tremendous feeling for, getting those turnovers. I think he's kind of a perfect, co-partner to Derwin. If Minter's idea is to just kind of let Derwin play safety. Alohi Gilman had a great year being, the team's free safety last year if they just want to keep Derwin at strong safety and not do as much as the Swiss Army knife stuff. So I still think he's kind of a perfect fit. And if you look at any PFF, contract evaluation for Alohi Gilman, he's really cheap. He's about, last time I looked at it, it was like 1 year, $2.7 million with $1 million guaranteed. Right. So I think that he could still totally play in this Minter defense. So I would go kind of with him as like under the radar player that maybe we don't talk as much, getting like a Minter or Harbaugh bump. To me, I think Alohi Gilman is that type of a player, especially when you saw the beginning of what he could do last year, and he was this goes kind of without saying, he was one of the highest graded safeties in the league in any charting, PFF or otherwise, and the film certainly showed the strides he made too. So I would love to bring him back on the cheap and just kind of run that back personally. So that would be kind of my example. I'm trying to think of a couple other ones outside the obvious. Issue is the Chargers don't have a lot of young talent on this team, and that's kind of a Tom Telesco problem. Another answer could be Quentin Johnston, I guess, if you want to kind of pump the hype there. I'm very mum on that right now, though. So as far as future plans outside of the obvious, I would go with probably Alohi Gilman. Connor, let me make sure I'm getting your last name right here. Hold on. Connor Brumfield. I hope I got that right. What positions would you target in the draft instead of free agency, and why? I don't know if this is an instead of free agency position. I think corner is probably one just because the Chargers are not going to have the spending capacity to go pursue some of the higher, big money options. Obviously, like they did in 2022 with J.C. Jackson, their cap situation isn't going to allow them to get, L'Jarius Sneed or, a player of that caliber kind of in this free agency period. And if you want to spend money on a corner in free agency, if it is less money, you are probably betting on like a Steven Nelson or a Ronald Darby, both players that I like, but both players that are over 30 years old, and that kind of tends to be the cutoff time for corners, unfortunately, when they are older. So considering that, the Chargers corners are, the Chargers, first of all, don't have, in my opinion, a Minter corner on this defense right now. I know Asante Samuel Jr. is kind of plugged in right now. But I think if you look at it earnestly, like they don't have a long-term answer at either, not that slot is something that you like decide to have a long-term solution towards. But, Steven has said it multiple times, and I have said it multiple times, I think. I think you double dip at corner in this draft, especially if you get more picks, because I think you just need more guys that can fit that Minter scheme. I wouldn't mind them signing like an older veteran corner who maybe comes on the cheap, but when I look at projecting for the future of this defense, in the draft, I think that corner just sticks out to me as the one where you have to go get some young guys. You need a talent infusion, and right now they don't have the financial means to do that via free agency. Trying to think of some other ones. Defensive line kind of strikes me as a draft instead of free agency position. Obviously, we've seen what the Chargers did a couple of years ago with Sebastian Joseph Day and Austin Johnson. Unfortunately, those signings didn't work out. And I just think the amount of defensive line talent in this draft is pretty crazy too, to the point where I think you could put, a bunch of guys in that like round 2 to round 4 range. I love Brandon Dorless out of Oregon. Obviously, Chris Jenkins looking up at Harbaugh at the combine. There's a bunch of guys I think you could plug into that interior that I think would make their, pass rush, their run defense significantly better than it is now, and can probably play on day one and be a contributor. So I'll start with cornerback and defensive line in terms of like just positions I wouldn't be mad at if they signed, some type of like cheaper veteran in free agency to kind of stabilize the room for the time being. But if you're talking about the long term of those positions, I think it goes through the draft. At Rotary Phone 4, a couple questions. What % chance do we actually stay at 5 and pick tackle or wide receiver, since there's good depth at both positions? Could the Chargers trade down multiple times? Let's say maybe going down to 11 and getting a second and fourth and getting another second. As far as the trade down back twice thing, I know this is something Brett Coleman has mentioned, and a couple other people have mentioned it as well. I just don't see it as terribly realistic. I think if the Chargers trade back once, that's probably it. And we're already kind of hearing rumblings of, potentially the first 4 picks of this draft being quarterback. Not that I'm saying that's going to happen, because I kind of think Arizona sticks and picks Marvin Harrison Jr. anyway with the draft capital they've already accumulated. So I don't see too much of a reason to trade back unless they get a Godfather offer from some team that wants JJ McCarthy. But to me, I think if you look at the last week kind of what the Chargers could do, the odds of them trading back in general probably dropped a little bit with the news that the first 4 picks could be quarterback. There is some value if that is the scenario that, like, okay, the Chargers are the 5th team and somebody can trade up for Marv. But Marv is also really incredible talent, and I wouldn't want the Chargers to trade back in that scenario. So I don't know. I think the optimal like trade back scenario for the Chargers to some extent is you create some scenario where the quarterbacks go 1 and 2, New England takes Marv, and then Arizona takes like Nabers or something, or Arizona takes Alt, and then they're like, well, maybe they wanted him at 5. So then, like, I think you could create like a trade back scenario. And there's going to be teams who I think would be angling to maybe trade up if there really was that much chaos and somebody trades out with the Cardinals and there's 4 quarterbacks, because then you're talking about potentially getting the best non-quarterback in the draft. So there is some value there for the Chargers. But this is a Chargers roster that also needs like a blue chip talent. So like I kind of think if Marv is there at 5, you don't trade out of that pick. And you can trade down in some other rounds later and get some picks for maybe Mac or something. But yeah, I would be a fan of trading down once if the board plays out quarterback, and then Marv, and then the Chargers are up at 5. I would personally stick and pick Nabers there, but if they wanted to trade back, fine. Trading back twice, I just think the logistics of that are a little bit tough to pull off. Wouldn't surprise me if they did, and then you're talking about, hey, you net like 3 or 4 picks from that. That's awesome. I don't see them necessarily doing that this draft, but trading back once, certainly possible. What percent chance do they stick and pick? I'll say like 65% chance that they stick and pick right now if I had to come up with a number in my head. And then I'll say like 35% chance they trade back. But obviously depends on how the board shapes up between now and draft day. But I still sell the notion that they trade back in the first round, just because I also think Harbaugh and Ortiz recognize to some extent that like they're not going to project to be a team that picks at 5 particularly often. And like if this opportunity sort of falls into your lap to either get an elite wide receiver or I'll say elite tackle, I hate that so much. If you get a chance to take, an elite, blue chip prospect at wide receiver or tackle, I just think it makes too much sense to do it than trade back personally. If the Chargers are going to be the team that we kind of expect them to be under Harbaugh, you're just not going to have this chance with this wide receiver class again, like realistically speaking. And, if you want to build the trenches too, who knows, if you trade back, what kind of prospects are going to be available. If they love Joe Alt, then they're going to take Joe Alt at 5. If they have Joe Alt and, as a popular guy that's been there, like Talise Fuaga, from Oregon State, similarly graded, then, I'm sure they wouldn't mind moving back. But right now, I do still think the way things are moving that they stick and pick at 5, but obviously a lot can change between now and draft day. This one comes from Bolt Up Deontay 619. Which non-head coach or coordinator on this staff do you think will have the biggest impact? I think you could go a couple names here. Ben Herbert, obviously, as the director of player performance, could have a potentially big impact if this team is able to stay healthy for any span longer than maybe 1 or 2 games during the season. That would be sick. So, I mean, that's certainly, if you're trying to get better at adjusted games lost and a lot of these metrics that the Chargers haven't done well with injuries the last 2 years, in particular in 2022 and 2023, then, I think that is the one that sticks out to me. Shane Day being reunited with Justin Herbert is obviously a big one. If that is what makes Herbert a little bit more comfortable, then I think by all means. And, Herbert, the most interesting thing he said to me on that podcast he did earlier this week with Chase Daniel and Trey Wingo was that he said that like Shane Day was one of his favorite coaches of all time, which really, stuck out to me. So I think that is a big move. If you certainly get a more confident, more, singularly minded Herbert locked in for this year because of Shane Day, then I think that cannot be understated, in addition to all, other changes the Chargers are making to their offensive and defensive staffs for sure. That was all the questions from Twitter. So now I'm going to go over to YouTube, where I asked you guys some questions as well. A lot of draft-centric questions. Some questions I hit already. So again, if I hit on your question, then I'll probably just go back to. I'll probably not answer it again if I already answered it, but I think we have some unique ones in here. This one comes from Liam. I think it's an interesting one. Say we trade back and we decide to go defense in the first round. Who is the most likely? Who is the defensive player that we are most likely to take? Assume either Khalil or Joey are both are gone here. So yeah, this is a scenario where if the Chargers were to trade back in the draft and draft defense, who would they take? Edge certainly is a possibility with a guy like Jared Verse there. Chop Robinson is certainly shooting up draft boards. And Chop Robinson, by the way, I don't think he's going to be a Charger, but he's an incredibly fun player to watch. It's like watching a bigger Hassan Reddick. It's crazy. But I would say defensive player trade back scenario. I don't know about a particular, I don't have access to the Chargers draft boards. So I don't know if I would go with a particular player, because then that gets into, okay, do the Chargers have Cooper DeJean higher than Terrion Arnold? Do they have Terrion Arnold higher? Do they have, who's their cornerback one on their, board? And then that gets into edge, who's their edge one, right? So I don't know about that. I would say corner to me is the more likely position if they were to trade back. Just because, again, like I said earlier, this team does not have a single Minter, corner on the roster right now. And I just think they need an influx of young talent more than any other position on their defense currently at the moment. You can make an argument for linebacker, but obviously that's a, non-premium position. And, they'll address that at some point by doing something. But yeah, I think if you trade back in the first round, for me, I would go corner. And that's just kind of a subjective thing for me too, where I think the cornerback talent in this draft, even in the first round and the depth later on, is kind of crazy. And I don't necessarily feel that way about the edge class. So I think in a scenario where, even if in theory you cut both Khalil and Joey, I kind of would still probably take corner. I just am kind of that mindset right now where they really need someone who can help them, particularly on the boundary and in the slot. And then you're probably also still angling to potentially replace Asante Samuel Jr., who, will be in a contract year this year. So you look at all those things, and to me, I just have the top of this class, being guys like Terrion Arnold and Cooper DeJean and Kool-Aid, Nate Wiggins, and then you even have guys that are blowing up the combine like Max Melton and Mike Samuel. Like, you have to come away with one or two of those guys, in this class. If it's not the first round dudes, then certainly the second, third, fourth round dudes, for sure. So for me, if I had to, pick between those positions or pick which defensive position they would go for if they would trade back, I don't know which one they're more likely to do, because again, I don't have Joe Ortiz's phone number. But I kind of think for the purposes of this Chargers team and, with what this cornerback class is, I think it'd have to be DB. Cornerback in second round. I don't totally understand this question. Cornerback in the second round, Nabers or Bowers in the first. I think he's just saying what his preference is. I got a lot of Nabers at 5 comments on this one. So yeah, I mean, that is where I stand, where if the draft is, again, quarterback, and then Marv is off the board, I think you have to go with Nabers personally. I just think the element of explosiveness he adds to this offense, and his ability to just create, all of those explosive plays, it's something the Chargers haven't had in a very, very long time, if they've ever had it. He, as a prospect, I've seen a lot of Antonio Brown comps for him, but the one that always comes across the screen to me when I watch Malik Nabers is kind of prime Odell, when he was with the Giants in that 2014 to 2017 era. He was just such a sick player, man. And Nabers reminds me of just a guy who plays the game with the similar feel for the routes, similar physicality. And then when he gets the ball, he can just be a blur when he's gone. Even if he's not I don't think Nabers is as technically refined as like a Marv is, and I have Marv as my wide receiver one over Nabers for what it's worth. I know that's also a civil war on Twitter between Chargers fans, but yeah, for me, even though Nabers is not the most technically refined receiver, like he is, probably the third best prospect that I have graded at the wide receiver position in the GAC era. I would go Marv, Jamar Chase, and then Malik Nabers as sort of the third guy. So, for all the people that are saying Nabers, I'm on your team. I will post more TikToks on Twitter to try to influence our position. So I hear you loud and clear. Sean O'Brien, thoughts on Braelon Allen? Is he the second coming of Derrick Henry? Derrick Henry is a very lofty comparison. I would advise against comparing prospects to one of the best running backs of all time. But to answer your question, I do love Braelon Allen. I think he's my running back one. No, Bucky Irving is my running back one. Braelon Allen is my running back 2 or 3 of this draft class right now. I kind of go back and forth between him and Audric Estime as sort of these like bigger freaks of nature that are just insane to watch, how they run and how they operate. And as Jordan Reed said on the Chargers Weekly podcast, I can't think of too many better scheme fits than Braelon Allen, Greg Roman, Jim Harbaugh. Like just that downhill rushing attack. I do think Braelon Allen truly is kind of like a perfect fit with the Chargers if they can get him in round 3, round 4. Like that is kind of the range for him at this point. And I don't think he's the second coming of Derrick Henry. I would comp him to more of like this will sound like disappointing to some people, but I think he's kind of more of an AJ Dillon where you can see some of that speed and athleticism come out more than you see it with like Derrick Henry, right? Derrick Henry is more at this point in his career, right? Even when he was in his prime, that sort of short yardage, push you over, create an explosive play by forcing, a bunch of people to look silly when tackling him. I don't think that's really Braelon Allen's game. I think Braelon Allen is a little bit more nimble on his feet, but also not as good of a short yardage, forced tackle, missing, back, in between the tackles as Henry is. But I also think he's probably a little bit better in space than Henry is. So kind of a trade-off there in terms of prospects. So even though they're both 240, 6'2", like I kind of think that's where the comparisons end. But certainly having him in this downfield running attack, I think would be absolutely awesome. What position do you feel is most likely to go in free? Oh, so this is an opposite of the question we had earlier. What position do you think is most likely to go in free agency rather than the draft? Interested to hear your thoughts. It's a good question. I think certainly if you're talking about center who will start from day one, now obviously the Chargers can draft Jackson Powers Johnson or Zach Frazier and make me look stupid if they do. But I really think once you get past Zach Frazier in this draft, and then you're at kind of the Cedric Van Pran, Drake Nugent like point where you're sort of on day 3 and you're looking for a center, I don't know if it makes a ton of sense to start that guy day 1. So ultimately, they will address center in both free agency and the draft is my prediction. But if we're talking about like starting center for 2024, I kind of think that's more likely to come in free agency right now. And if you look at the market, there's guys like Brian Allen and Mason Cole who have gotten released. And there is somebody named Graham Glasgow who I think would kind of be an incredible fit with the Chargers. I think if I'm remembering the most recent PFF contract projection for him correctly, it's like 2 years, $6.5 million per year at $13 million. And I think if you can do that and you can find a way to get under the cap and create, the 30, 40 million in cap space that we, expect the Chargers to maybe create after some of these extensions and restructures and cuts and trades, I think that it makes a lot of sense to me. I would love to see a Graham Glasgow type player come from Detroit because he's still kind of at the top of his game and really was only cut because of, the contract that the Lions signed him to. And, just gearing up for the future, but he can still play. So I would say if you're talking about getting a starting center, because if they don't go for center in the first 2 rounds, I don't know if they're getting a starting center. I kind of would address that in free agency in preparation of the draft. If you're not super convinced that you're going to like trade back into the first round for Jackson Powers Johnson or maybe Zach Frazier or a prospect like that is off the board before the Chargers get a chance to pick. So we'll see. This is kind of tightly related to what I just said, but this comes from at the Donatello. We know the Chargers must sign a starting center. Who are your top 3 or 4 centers in order, draft and or free agent, and why? I don't know if I have a top 3 or 4 list. Like I said, I think you throw in Graham Glasgow as an option. I think he'd be awesome. I think you can go to the next tier of guys, sort of like a Mason Cole or a Braelon Allen. Honestly, if you're just talking about stashing somebody for depth, I know he's not a free agent, but like Brendan Hymas played pretty well last year when he was asked to. Not that he was asked to do a whole lot at center, and I certainly wouldn't want to have him as starting center this year entering the season, but I think he actually did pretty well in terms of depth last year. So actually excited to see kind of what he might be able to do in the preseason once the Chargers get to that point this year. But again, I think the free agent options are rather known. Graham Glasgow has to be kind of number 1. If Jackson Powers Johnson is available in round 2, I'm kind of down for it. I'm not necessarily a proponent of trading back into round 1 for him, only because it's kind of it's an important position, but it's also a non-premium position, and the Chargers so far don't have excess draft capital to be able to move like a team like a Houston or an Arizona might in this draft until they end up getting more picks or they do trade back or make a move like that. So for me, when I'm looking at the draft, I mean, Jackson Powers Johnson Jr. in the second is a dream. Would love Zach Frazier in the second. I'd probably say the center that I mostly trust outside of that, who I'm not convinced is totally a day 1 starter, would be Cedric Van Pran. I just trust, his functional athleticism, and what he's done in the run game at Georgia is pretty crazy. Still not, terribly technically refined, but I think he's a good prospect. If you want to take a center in round 3 to round 5, a little bit later on in the draft. So yeah. At Casey Boyette 411. Round 2 to 4 running back targets that fit Harbaugh and the GM system. Again, like I said earlier, I don't know if this is about fitting Harbaugh and Ortiz's system so much as it is about fitting Greg Roman's system. And Braelon Allen to me is the king of the running backs in that regard. I don't think he's the best running back in this class, but if you're talking about who is the best fit for what Greg Roman wants to do, then I do kind of think it is somebody like a Braelon Allen. And adding on to that, I think, you start talking about Bucky Irving. Bucky Irving's my running back 1 in this class. If he's available in round 4, I think he probably goes late round 3 at this point, honestly. I think he pulled the trigger. This is a guy who is incredibly athletic, can play downhill too. I mean, he had something like 4 yards after contact last year. This is not a guy who I also think a bit of a myth here, regarding the Greg Roman run game. And I get the connection to Braelon Allen, but the reason I like Braelon Allen is because he's in this incredible downhill running force and is actually pretty nimble in his feet. But I do think there's this connection between the running back is big, so Harbaugh and Roman will want him, that some people are making. And I don't necessarily think that that's true, because if you actually look at the history of Harbaugh and Roman, their 3, most, representative running backs of what they've done are a 5'9" Frank Gore, a 5'9" Mark Ingram, and a 5'8" Blake Corum. So I don't necessarily think it's a size thing as much as it is, can you, run downhill, follow your blockers? Do you have smart vision out of the backfield? A lot of these other traits. How are you in pass pro, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, you could look at running backs in that way as well. But the reason I, link Braelon Allen to them, and I think a lot of people link Braelon Allen to them potentially, is because of what he can do kind of on the field, not necessarily his size. And Bucky Irving is another, great running back in that regard. I know people always ask me who the day three Alex running back is, as I, make that list every year. Previous recipients include Khalil Herbert and Pacheco and Abanikanda last year, who I loved a lot. Um, I would say this year's day three running back that I don't know if he's a fit for the system, but the Chargers did meet with him at the combine, and I think also met with him at the Senior Bowl. A name to look out for is Troy running back Kamani Vidal, who I think is really fun to watch play. I think he's Troy's leading rusher, which is kind of a crazy stat, but just the athleticism he plays with, the elusiveness he's able to play with, making guys miss, and he's a threat to catch out of the backfield as well. I just think he can be used in so many different ways as that change of pace back with the Chargers, to the point where it's like, okay, if you go sign a Gus Edwards or a Zach Moss in free agency, and you still maybe have Spillers, you're running back 3 on the roster, and you need a change of pace guy. Kamani Vidal is really fun to watch in that regard, and kind of reminds me a little bit actually of what the Ravens did in undrafted free agency last year, where they got Keaton Mitchell, who unfortunately got hurt last year. But I love him as a prospect. I love Kamani Vidal as a prospect too. He's somebody that's been rocketing up my draft board. So I just wanted a chance to talk about him. I don't know if he's necessarily the biggest fit for what Harbaugh and Roman want to do, but to me, he's awesome to watch. Trying to think of other running backs who are like a fit. Like Trey Benson would obviously be a guy, but I think he might go a little bit higher than the Chargers would want. And then when you kind of get into like the round 5 to like 7 guys, you're looking less at bell cows and more of the Vidal, Frank Gore Jr., kind of tier, where it's more the like elusive, shifty running back. Although Frank Gore Jr., obviously with connections to Frank Gore, I think that's somebody I wouldn't be surprised if Harbaugh, looked at with, kind of how he's built his staff, and, has some loyalty to those 49er days, as we've seen in building the staff. At Bruins 31, because this is the last question, by the way, because cornerback is probably the biggest need on the roster, how do they address it? I said this, but to me, I think you have to take 2 corners in this draft. I don't have to is a little bit strong, because right now they still only have like 8 picks. So 2 of any position could be considered a lot, but I think you have to get some big, kind of rangy, versatile corners. I throw Max Melton into that mix, obviously. Sanger still would be kind of a lockdown, slot guy for them. And then you're talking about, a bunch of other cornerbacks that I like outside of that first round tier. Love TJ Tampa. He is an incredibly fun watch. Renardo Green. It's just so much cornerback talent in this draft. You at least have to walk away with 1 if you're not going to walk away with 2. And as much as I don't love the cornerback market, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I probably think that they have to sign maybe like 1 veteran guy, kind of like a Ronald Darby, somebody along those lines, who maybe is a little bit older, but is still effective as a player for like a 1-year type contract. A couple other directions. I like Steven Nelson, a little bit, even though you're kind of betting on the older age aspect, which is not necessarily like fun to do in free agency. But again, like I said earlier, they don't necessarily have the cap to go make a big money move like a L'Jarius Sneed or somebody like that. So that's kind of born out of necessity to some extent. So, yeah, I guess that'll do it for this episode of Bolt Breakdowns. Thank you guys, as always, for watching. I should have an interview lined up next week. More details on that to come about who may be coming on the program. It's a little bit of a tease. It's not a Chargers player, by the way. I should get that out before the comments get like excited or I end up disappointing people. But I do think this is a pretty fun guest who may be coming on next week. So more details on that to come. We are, coming up on the draft, free agency. So as always, stay tuned into Twitter, my stuff on Chargers Wire, as well as the stuff I'm doing on this channel once a week. So fun times ahead for us Chargers fans. So excited to see what happens. And as always, see you guys next time, or see you guys next week. And bolt up.